and welcome to the Islamic Finance Show. Throughout the series, we'll explore the varying aspects of Islamic finance and what is affecting it in an increasingly changing financial landscape. Islamic finance came into prominence at the time of the financial crash in 2008, having escaped the worst of the crisis. It offered itself as a challenger to conventional finance, but has it lived up to this? Joining me to discuss this on the show today is Amina Ahmed, a fintech innovation and product consultant. And also joining me is Dr. Nunung Nurul Hidayah, Associate Professor in the Accounting Department at Southampton University. She also supervises PhD students in Islamic finance and has taught and developed curriculums in Islamic finance at educational institutes in Indonesia and at the Al Maktoum Institute in Dundee. Welcome, ladies. Thank you for coming on the Islamic Finance Show.
Hello.
I'm going to get straight to the question that we're going to be addressing on the show today. Has Islamic finance become a challenger, an alternative finance, or merely a religious facade marketing products to the pious? Nurul, we'll start with you.
I think we should see it in two ways. In one way, it has fulfilled the demand of an alternative religious compliance finance. But we have to also look at it from the pathways it has going through so far. If we look at from the history and the initial development of this alternative is to fulfill alternative finance that capture the social and then also profit, economic and other spectrum as well to provide alternative for the society. But if we look at so far, it has grown into somewhat similar to the conventional finance products. When you are competing, most likely you will try to mimic each other and also try to compete with each other so that you be ahead from the other. That's the danger of it. It is, I think, a point for the whole Islamic finance industry to reflect from the history, the development. Are we still in line with the original objective, or are we somewhat different or going into non-alternative, you can call it that way?
Okay, what are your thoughts on this, Amina?
I think facades may be a little bit maybe reductive, a little bit harsh. Yeah, I'd agree with that. But I definitely don't think that the potential's been fulfilled. I tend to agree. I think that we're trying to compete on product, so product by product, which structurally might work, revenue-wise just won't work. Like, it doesn't make any sense, because why would, the majority of customers are in, for the main part, stable financial institutions. So competing on product when you are not innovating on the product or even innovating on the technology that underlies the product is probably where Islamic finance could start to differentiate and start to look at alternatives in its truest sense. And actually go back to first principles, I guess, as well. And I mean, there's a huge opportunity there around how do we talk to the customers in the way that they want to be talked to, but also what they're asking us for as well. There's so much out there at the moment that, kind of can really elevate all faith-based financing.
Okay, well, you mentioned the original objective.
Yeah.
So has any of that been achieved, or how can it be achieved? How can we move closer to the original objective of Islamic finance and what it wants to offer?
So if we go back to the original history, it's just, it is an alternative to provide empowerment for the society. It is supposed to be, equity-based alternative for the society, but it's going into debt-based product at the moment. If we look at how Islamic finance industry nowadays, and we also nowadays look at, for example, the engagement with derivatives. Instead of providing alternative, there are two things here. This is the derivative product, and this is the contracts in Islamic finance. And instead of how the contract should be fulfilled, but how this could be blended into the alternatives that is offered by conventional finance.
Are you talking about structuring now, structuring of products?
So the structuring process here is then making the product of Islamic finance quite similar to the conventional finance in a way. That's just one example. But we also need to look at, Islamic finance is actually sort of a sideway from Islamic economics. We can only look at Islamic finance only from Islamic bank. So far, the focus of Islamic finance is only on Islamic banking. But there are other things that the society has actually needed. For example, in the UK, we look at everybody is using pension scheme, but is there any Sharia compliant pension scheme? Like myself, it's very difficult to get Sharia compliant pension schemes. People in the society, they have their own saving to support that kind of events, but there is nothing that Islamic bank would talk or anything in Islamic finance would breach the alternatives as well. And recently, if we look at just in the beginning of August, I think if you look at online, there's a new scheme that the government want to offer called unmortgage. So to link those people who don't have the capability to have deposit or initial fund to get the housing.
Which is a huge problem for many people, particularly young people in this country.
Yeah, and then link it with those investors, and this is still an early idea, but this will be, I think, breached by an insurance company. But there is something that is very useful for the society, something that everybody is needed, rather than financialization products.
What are your thoughts, Amina?
I agree in the most part for the end points that you've made. So what's useful? What are products at their base? They're trying to fulfill means financial products for sure. Mm-hmm. They're trying to fulfill certain aspects of what we want to do with our lives, how we want to live, how we live, where we live, what we can have access to, and what we can aspire to, I guess, as well. So mortgage is really important. I actually don't think it has to be as complicated as we make it. I don't think, we can look at financialisation, we can talk a little bit about that in some detail, but actually for the majority of us as customers of banking services, we have to be customers of banks because we need credit from them, we need cash. That's how we live. Mm-hmm. So actually mortgages, I don't think they have to be that complicated. Yielders are doing a pretty good bash at this, so they're kind of an up and coming, they're a crowdfunding platform, and they're really...
And they're based on, the whole model is financial technology, offering something, structuring things in a different way, and it's Sharia compliant.
Absolutely. And it's fulfilling a need though, because it's crowdfunded. People are joining that and they are offering,
so it's a more inclusive approach.
I think it's inclusive, but it gets to the core of what we're trying to do. People are trying to buy houses, they want to be Sharia compliant, but actually Sharia compliance is also something that we need to start to define and bring back in and talk about universally as opposed to in kind of like alternative and separate silos. And I think that's kind of where Islamic finance needs to take a little bit of a step back actually and go, we are part of faith-based finance. We are part of a much broader community here of people who wants to invest. So based on religious values, but also based on, what we're seeing in the research. People, adults with consumer spending who have cash to spend, about 86% of them, so that's like kind of 18 to 34, 35-year-olds, 86%.
With disposable income.
Exactly. 86% want to look at socially responsible investments and finance, and that's coming out of Morgan Stanley, it's coming out of BlackRock.
I think the mainstream, and there's kind of a movement with the youth at the moment. They're looking more towards ethics, social impact, and they want that reflected in their lives, whether it's through the products and services they choose. And so they are forcing, in a way, the hand of many institutions, whether they be financial or otherwise, to shift and change their offerings. So what I want to understand is, with the current offerings we have from the Islamic banks, what needs to be done? And first, do they offer something different to conventional finance in a true sense? And second, depending on what your answer might be, can we elaborate on that and then look at perhaps which direction we can go in, given that the mainstream is moving through a push through the youth to more social impact?
I think we need to go back to social impact first, because in general, let alone Islamic finance, there are a lot of research in social impact which conclude that social impact in itself is a long way to be defined. So what do you mean by social impact? How do you measure social impact? One of the students, a PhD student I recently teach, also looking at social impact, and it's very difficult to define social impact. If we come back to Islamic finance, the social impact that was dreamt of in the beginning, that was imagined in the beginning, is to provide empowerment for the society. Those entrepreneurs, especially young entrepreneurs who don't have much capital.
Is that happening though at the moment? It's all very well talking about what Islamic finance is supposed to be about, but what we've actually got to look at is the reality of the matter. What's out there? What's happening on the court?
I don't think that's happening at the moment, because if you look at the contract of Islamic finance, the profit and loss sharing contract is the answer to empower the society, which is musyarakah and mudarabah, or partnerships, and joint venture contracts. It's hardly being offered by all Islamic banks around the world.
You mean talking about shared risk,
yes,
operating with each
shared
other?
Risk and equity. Okay. There is something, because if we
between the financier and the consumer.
Profit sharing
to interest.
Yeah. But if you look at the contract itself, we need to, unless you go to the detail of the contract, then you will find out whether it is really profit sharing or not. So if we look at from the history, if we want to achieve the empowerment or social impact, the profit and loss sharing scheme should be promoted first. But it takes a lot of risk for Islamic finance industry and Islamic financial institution. That's why they moved down into the second contract called murabaha, or in different stands. We have commodity murabaha, where basically one of my interview and my research said, what can we do now? What we have is commodity on the paper. If we don't run with this, we don't have any industry going.
Yeah, I mean, can I just bring you into the conversation? With this, with everything that Nurul has said, what are your thoughts on that? And also, given the structures and the way Islamic finance is being offered at the moment, what's the way forward then? Do we need to revisit and go back to baseline?
Ooh,
and is that realistic?
Well, to take the first point, I think I strongly disagree with what you've just laid out, because it's the classic fallacy of banking, which is we need to start looking at, you want to make profit for the bank. That's why you're talking about the two-tiered contracts, and you are trying to boost and inflate and make viable a balance sheet that then can be traded, because that's the whole purpose of starting a bank. It's not out the goodness of people's hearts. So actually I think that's
bottom line is profit.
But I think that's a big fallacy of where we start with this conversation, right? Which is that's what we all care about, and it's not. Someone wants to start a bank as a profitable venture, they want to be the CEO of a bank, and a profitable bank at that. Customers couldn't care less. So I've worked for large retail and European UK banks. They don't care. I've had clients who are big, huge US banks, and they don't. Their customers universally do not care. We've seen the same in Germany. We've seen the same in Australia to a certain degree as well, and actually, throughout Malaysia, Philippines. We have similar. So let's start there as first principles. Customers want to get on with their lives. They don't care how it's structured or what it's going on. And when you talk about it's really difficult to, sorry, Serena, when you talk about it's difficult, right, to define what social impact is, I actually think that's slightly nonsensical as well, because we're looking, we make it complicated. We're all human, right? We like to make things a little bit complicated to get a solution out there, and we're really smart for solving it. It's not complicated. We don't want to, let's start with some potentials, right? We don't want to trade in arms. We don't want to get off the back of commodities, because commodities trading actually harms the environment. It's the fundamental principles of, or simple principles, like just really simple things that probably the vast majority of the population care about and really, really kind of want to be a part of, because we also understand what's happening. Kind of, we're on a clock now as well. So what the harm that we're doing to the environment is really important. So why can't we start there? And it's what all kind of challenger, actually, I would say, organisations in finance, but also in financial technology, so fintech, are really looking at, and they're making it really simple. It doesn't have to be that complicated.
I just want to, you mentioned consumers, you know, not caring, and ultimately they don't. Like you said, they want to continue with their lives, and they just want everything simple and functional and easy.
And cheap.
And cheap.
So, you know, or reasonable.
Or reasonable, yeah. So I need to bring in some of the new fintechs or financial technology digital banks that are making waves at the moment. We've got the likes of Monzo, Starling, Revolut. Now, what's interesting about these digital banks, they are shaking things up. They maybe not to the extent that, you know, the headlines may suggest. However, what they are doing that the conventional banks are not doing is they're listening to their consumers. They're actually trying to hear what their customers want with the feedback. Don't get me wrong, ultimately they're a business, and they want to expand and continue with that and turn a profit at some point, which most of them are not turning a profit at the moment. But what I'm trying to say is, like, if you go to the social media pages of these fintechs, the way they respond to their consumers is quite rapid. Their customer services is way more responsive than you get from traditional bricks and mortar banks. So there's something in this. You know, instead of going from a technological structural perspective, maybe go from the consumer element and then bring it back to what they want.
And also it comes to branding, if I'm honest. It's the way that you market yourself. It's the way that you, and that's talking to customers directly.
So let's talk about that. So Islamic finance and Islamic banks have been in existence in the UK for what, between 10 and 15 years, depending on which bank you look at. So why is it that these digital banks within the last 5 years have been headline news, but Islamic finance hasn't been headline news in the way it could have been like this? What's missing? Is it the marketing? Are they not putting forward the value proposition of what Islamic finance?
I think there's a combination.
Yeah.
So I think it's marketing, but I also think
quite complex,
the products,
and
the products aren't actually simple, and they are not accessible.
I want to pick up on accessibility. I think it's, you know, it's rather difficult. It's not only in Islamic finance, but all banks in the UK. If you compare it with financial technology, it's slightly difficult. Let's say if you want to open an account, I went with my daughter, my oldest, to open an account. We have to come several times, and it's so difficult. When you go to Monzo, for example, or any other, alternatives, you can just go online and then
within seconds you can have an account.
You have an account. And I mentioned.
Why did you choose for your daughter not to open a Monzo account?
She ended up opening up a Monzo account because it was very difficult for her. Oh, mommy, I need to, because rather than giving her money every week, it's very unpractical, isn't it? So I want to go back on the mortgage part. If you look at the alternatives as a comparison, this is. It is not really accessible for everybody to get Islamic mortgage in the UK. It's not easy. You have to go through all the requirements and everything. So if you look at the data for Islamic Bank, I think most of those who perhaps has the product or Islamic mortgage product are those who have perhaps quite substantial amount of salary or I think foreign investor who want to buy properties in the UK. So there is another thing. Part of my research, I also interviewed customers, and most of them found very difficult to get this product.
I think it's not just mortgages. I think it's perhaps the other products and services.
Yeah. Mortgages, investments, so anything asset-based. Right,
it's very difficult.
It is difficult, but also it's made difficult. I'll be really honest with you. I've worked on an Islamic mortgage product on a couple where we've been advising, and probably 60 to 70% of the final decision on why we would close that product set down was based on the bureaucracy behind it. Yeah. So we did not know where we could get this kind of signed off as compliant, and you have to renew it every there's a certain period where I think every 6 months we're trying to renew. So there's a problem and an issue with what we define as Sharia compliant, what we define as Islamic bank finance.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask you very quickly because we're kind of running out of time. So obviously there's some key messages coming here from the discussion. Just looking at how Islamic finance could offer itself up as a challenger, what do you think are some of the pertinent things that could be looked at moving forward?
Two big things: get on board and start to understand where you sit with open banking. So open APIs that's the new standard.
So
in
let me
banking.
just explain.
Yes.
Open banking is a setup whereby one bank can get the information from another, the data, on the premise that the customer has given the permission, and then it can find products and services that are cheaper and offer them direct to the customer.
It's an easier way to switch and kind of look at your financial life holistically.
Sure.
And that is where it will become easier for Sharia compliant or ethical banking, let's call it, or faith-based banking to start to make its mark.
Okay.
That's
And Nurul, any
And I
insight?
think to embrace the society, the wider people, talk with them, what do they need, and how to work with them together to provide alternatives for them as well, rather than just playing on the high level of financialization, and then perhaps have a portfolio of different things. Yes, Islamic bank, Islamic finance need to sustain, but that's part of the pot that they have to run. But they also perhaps, there have been discussion of Islamic banking for social banking, something like that, but never has never happened so far.
But I think we can move away from that as well.
Yeah.
So Islamic finance, Islamic banking, faith-based banking in general is profitable. So let's start calling it what it is.
Yeah.
And that is fine, because that also makes it better for the customers. Longer term, the more customers you bring onto it. And talking to your customers is key. It's not about saying these are the products we will offer those particular customers. It's what do customers want from us. Gatehouse Bank has about 70% of its book is non-Muslim, or identify as non-Muslim. So there is a market for it. And also you've got to look at trends. Asia, we will have about 30% of the population of the world will be living on that continent. 2050 for Africa, it'll be the most populous continent on the planet. So actually, let's start talking about those.
Nurul, forgive me, we could talk about this all day, but unfortunately we're out of time. But thank you for the very insightful conversation. Now, if you'd like to comment or share your thoughts and opinions on what we've discussed today, then tweet us at Islam Channel, or contact us via Facebook on Islam Channel TV with hashtag The Islamic Finance Show. We'd love to hear your thoughts and views. Next time, we'll be looking at ethics within Islamic finance, so be sure to tune in. But for now, thanks again to my guests for joining me today. And of course, many thanks to you at home for watching. See you next time.